Good evening. If you want to go ahead and turn your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 4, that's where we're going to be for the whole time this evening. What I want to talk about today is rebuilding, or building the things in our life that need it. And I want to look solely in Nehemiah chapter 4 to do this today. The whole goal of Nehemiah in the book of Nehemiah was it was this man who was convicted to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It was something that he set his heart to do, and he did it. So I want to use his example for how we are to do the same in our own life today. In the book of Nehemiah, the walls of Jerusalem, they had just been destroyed, and they're in shambles. They're in shambles from the kingdom of Babylon, plundering the city of Jerusalem. So it had been 90 years since these walls have been functioning for their original purpose to protect the temple of God. For 90 years, they've been destroyed. But then in 539 BC, we see this great return of the people. We see it recorded in the book of Ezra, these two returns. And in it, these people, they purposed in their hearts to rebuild the temple. And after about 20 years, this temple, it was rebuilt. However, the walls that used to defend this glorious temple, they were still destroyed. And they were nothing but rubble at this point. And for decade after decade, people, they would just walk over the rubble. They would walk over the stone and the rubble that was in their place. They would walk over it to the places they needed to go in their life. And they could see every day what a disgraceful place they were living in. But it didn't occur to anyone to clean up the great mess that they were living in. Instead, this became their normal way of living. Have you ever seen anything like that? Maybe there was some mess in someone's life where it just really affected you, but it just seems like to them, their own mess, it didn't seem to bother them at all. Just because something is normal to you doesn't mean it is right or good or working how it should be. Think about it from the perspective of your own life. Just because you've lived a certain way for some time, maybe your whole life, that doesn't mean there isn't something that's wrong, or that doesn't mean there's something that's wrong in it, or some rebuilding or building that needs to go on in your life. Or maybe think about a church. This church has been around for years and years, and it's had this certain way of worshiping. It's done this for years and years. Just because it's something they've always done doesn't make it right. What's normal to us may not always be right. Rebuilding is something that is needed in everyone's life. There is no one here that doesn't need to build something that is lacking, or maybe rebuild some problem that's in your life right now. Even though everyone is in need of this rebuilding, this building, the unfortunate truth is that people often, they don't do it. I mean, how many people have you seen in your life truly make a change? And I mean this complete 180-degree shift in their life to where they're just a totally different person. And don't get me wrong, this does happen. And when it does happen, it is so encouraging to see, but often it doesn't. And the reason why it's so rare is because it's hard. It's hard to rebuild a lifestyle. It's hard to build habits and good characteristics in your life. So I want to look at Nehemiah chapter 4. I want to look at this so we can see the reality of truths about rebuilding in our life that make it so hard to do so. And then I want to see how Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem were so successful in doing so despite the great work. So what I want to first do in this lesson, I want to look at the external opposition in building. Not only the external, but the internal that there is in building. And finally, when we see all the opposition that there is in building, I want us to see how we can overcome it. When we build and add certain things to our lives to better ourselves and become more fruitful children of God, we are often faced with conflict from the outside. Read with me in Nehemiah 4, picking up in verse 1. It says, "Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged. And he jeered at the Jews, and he said in the presence of the brothers and of the armies of Samaria, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish it up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burn one at that? Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." So we built the wall, and the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Asdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. So we see as these people, they begin to build the wall, the first obstacle for them is that there is an enemy. There is an enemy that hates to see you building fruits in your life. And for the people here, this enemy is this man named Sanballat. And we see the first thing he does is he tries to ridicule the people. We see in verse 1, when he heard that the people were building, it says that he was angry and greatly enraged. Have you ever seen this in your life? Maybe you hear what is right and you start to act a little differently from your friends. You don't do what they do. You don't say what they say anymore. And because of that, have they ever gotten angry at you? Maybe your goodness and the things that you're building in your life, it's showing them what they're lacking. And oftentimes people in our lives, they will get angry at us. And then notice in verse 2 and 3, notice how he's mocking the people here. He says, "What are these feeble Jews doing?" He kind of uses this sarcasm. He says, "Will they revive the stones out of the heap of rubbish?" Sanballat here, he's insulting the very capability of them being able to accomplish such a great task of rebuilding this wall. He's calling them feeble, saying, how could such a weak people as this rebuild such a broken wall? What he's trying to do here, he's trying to make them feel hopeless. It then goes to say what they are building, if a fox was even to go up on that wall, it would destroy it. Basically saying, even if such a feeble people as this find some way to build this wall, it'll be no use, because even such a tiny creature as a fox will be able to destroy it. Have we ever here been mocked because of the change that we've been trying to make in our life? How many times have people tried to discount the things you've been trying to build in your life? And we start to see it kind of shift for the people here and how their enemies plan to attack. It starts to shift from this verbal form of attack to this physical form of intimidation. In verses 7 and 8, we start to see this great alliance start to form. These people now, they have all these great enemies around them plotting to fight against them. I imagine the people as they're building this wall and they look out and they see these great armies and these massive cities all united for one purpose, and that is to stop them from this great endeavor of building this wall. Imagine the intimidation they would be feeling right now. And haven't we all felt like this? We feel like everything in the world is just rooting against us, and there's just these countless things pressing down on us, trying to attack us and stop us from our great endeavor of building. When you look around in your life, does it seem like you're only surrounded by enemies? The enemy is trying to intimidate you to stop your own progress. The people here, they are trying to build this wall, but there is an enemy. And they're trying to do everything they can to prevent them from accomplishing what they purpose to do. And not only do we see this external conflict for these people here, but we also see there's much internal conflict in their hearts here, trying to complete this wall. Let's read in verse 10. It said, In Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. There is a great internal conflict for these workers, for they are greatly discouraged. The people, they look at this mighty task and they're distressed. The people here, it's like they come up to Mount Everest and they're at the very bottom, and instead of just going and taking the first step, knowing what they need to do, instead all they're doing is looking up at the very top, and they're seeing the great journey that is ahead of them. When you focus on the end of a task, you will always be frozen in discouragement. They look at this wall all battered and destroyed, and they're discouraged, for they say there is too much rubble. They see how hard this task truly will be. The very enormity of the task has completely diminished their zeal here. And they say to themselves, our strength is failing, and we just can't do it. Have you ever tried to get something right in your life? You try to start building something, and you start to feel these three things. You start to say to yourself, there's just too much trash. There's too much rubble in my life. Maybe we look at ourselves and all we can see are the giant problems, the giant sin that's in our lives, and we think to ourselves, there's no hope. I have too much work to do. I'll never be able to accomplish this. And how many times when we go ahead and start building, we start to feel like our strength is failing. We just can't do it anymore. That's what these people here are doing. They're focusing on their own weakness instead of focusing on God's power right now. And they are discouraged. The next internal conflict the people face is this great fear. The people, they're afraid. They have such a great task to accomplish. They feel they don't have enough strength to build this. But they're also looking out to see all the great armies that is all united, surrounded for one purpose, plotting against them, and they're scared. And in the midst of all this discouragement, there's all these rumors of attacks, and the people of Jerusalem in verse 12, we see they hear about this, and they are pleading to the workers to stop this great task. It says they said this 10 times for them to stop building. This idea that time and time again, they're coming to these workers, telling them, stop it. Have you ever had a good work in your mind to do, but then you thought about how hard it would be, and the fear of that, it just completely stopped you from doing what you needed to do? These people here, they were scared. But as we're about to see, they didn't let that fear control them. Fear is a real thing in our life that can stop us from building what we need to in our life. Maybe it's the fear of how it's going to take up our time. Maybe it's the fear of who or what we're going to have to give up to do this. The fear of what others will do to us because of what we do. Or maybe it's this. Maybe we've been hiding the mess that is in our lives for so long, for years and years, and we're just scared to finally come to the reality and the acknowledgement of how messy our lives truly are. There is fear everywhere in rebuilding, and these people certainly feel it. So there is an enemy in our rebuilding. There's these both external and internal enemies that we face that are pressing down on us daily during this process. But how do we overcome the opposition that is thrown our way in this endeavor? I want to look at how Nehemiah could get these people to finish such a great job whenever they felt the way that they did. Let's read in verse 13. In verse 13, it says, "So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, 'Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.' When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me, and I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, 'The work is great and widely spread, and we are separated far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us. Our God will fight for us.' So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of the dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. These people, they knew that their strength was failing. They knew they had a great task ahead of them with many obstacles, but what else did they know? They knew that the Lord was awesome, and they knew that he was a great God. And Nehemiah, he tells them, look at that. Brethren, the greatest cure to our fear is changing it. And the greatest antidote to our fear is the continual acknowledgement that God is the one to fear and not anything else, not the enemies. When we understand how great God is compared to the enemies, what happens is our fear, it will start to shift to only fearing the Lord. Once they focus their minds on the Lord and his greatness, what did they understand? In verse 15, they knew that God was in this, and they knew that he was frustrating the plans of the enemies trying to entrap them. When you start to work with God to build and rebuild your life, one thing you're going to start to see is that God is there and that he is working with you, and he wants to work with you to build the greatest pile of rubble, the greatest pile of trash that may be in your life right now. These men, they remembered God, and because they remember, we see the determination in verse 20 that our God will be the one to fight for us. Remembrance of the Lord will always equal determination in our lives. And we see in verse 16 and 17, the next way we need to build our lives is that we must be armed to fight. In verse 16, it says, from that day on, these men, they were armed to fight. These men, they realized that the only way they could do this was with God. But they also realized that it was going to take some effort and action on their part. So we see what they did in verse 17. They labored with one hand, and they held a weapon in the other. These men, they saw the enemy, but they also saw the objective, and they were determined to finish. So they did both. They built with one hand, and they guarded with the other. And that is exactly how we need to live our lives in building fruits. There is an enemy, and we must be on guard for the temptations and the trials that is thrown our way. Because, brethren, there is a roaring lion coming to us daily, enticing us with our deepest desires, so we must be armed. And something we have to understand is that just as these people had a sword, we have a sword as well. We have a sword that God has given us, Ephesians 6, the Word of God. And the question is for us, are you using it? Are you keeping your sword? And do you know it? Because if we don't have those three things, there is no way we can defend ourselves. Defend ourselves against the wiles of the devil. And the final weapon, and the one we've seen most in this text, is prayer. Did you notice that? Prayer in the book of Nehemiah is his greatest weapon. Every time an adversary or obstacle comes to this people, what does Nehemiah do? He prays. In verse 4, after the people were being mocked, Nehemiah, he prays. In verse 9, when all the enemies are surrounding them, Nehemiah, what he does, he prays. Nehemiah constantly used this to rebuild the wall. When's the last time when you heard bad news, the first thing you did was pray? I want you to ask yourself that in your life right now. Is your first instinct prayer? When all you can see is that enemies are surrounding you and there is a great piece of rubble in your life discouraging you, what's your first instinct? For Nehemiah, it was prayer. There is an enemy, and the one thing he doesn't want you to do is build or rebuild something in your life that is going to get you closer to the Lord. So be on guard. We are in need of building. We are in need of adding things in our lives to protect our souls. The people were rebuilding this wall in Nehemiah to protect this sacred thing, the temple of God. And do you know what you are today? You're the temple of God. We have the same responsibility as that wall in Nehemiah did. We must protect our temple. So how are you protecting your temple? Have we been building the things that we are in need of to fully serve God? That's the question. We must have this determination in building. The determination to say, whatever's going on in my life, whatever amount of rubble, whatever external enemies, internal enemies are in my life, I'm going to focus on growing closer to God and building what I need to build and to rebuild the aspects of my life that need it. So are you building? There is much opposition externally as there is internally. But we have a God to look to and the tools necessary in the Word and in prayer to combat all the pressures that we have faced and that we will face when we try to do a good thing in our life. We must build and add the lacking aspects to our spiritual lives. I asked the scripture reading to be from Colossians 3 because we read about all the things that we're supposed to put on as children of God. But the verse before that section gives us this description of Christ. It says that Christ is all and in all. We build and put things on in our life because Christ is everything. Christ is everything, and He is worth everything in our life. And He is why we build and rebuild. No matter how hard it is, we do it. We must build and put Christ on in our life. Maybe you're here today and you're angry. Maybe you need to build some peace. Maybe you're here today and you have some hatred in your heart and you need to build some love. Maybe you're here today and you have apathy. Maybe you just don't care about all the suffering that's going on in here, all the suffering that is out in the world, all the lost souls that are there, and you just don't care. Maybe you need to build compassion. If you're here today and you're in need of building, and maybe you're here today and you aren't a Christian and you want to start building the things in your life to grow closer to God, then come forward as we stand and as we sing.